I'm going to lose my mind if someone doesn't explain why there's a harpist in the lobby. Victor Nolan growled into his earpiece as he stepped out of his sleek black Maserati, adjusting the cuffs of his designer tux. I booked this entire venue for our investor gala. Why are there flower petals on the floor? His assistant's voice crackled. Sir, according to the reservation, I don't care what the reservation says, I paid 50 grand to lock down this ballroom. If it's not mine, someone's getting fired. Victor yanked the door open to the Bellevue Grand Hotel's crystal ballroom and stopped cold. There were no investors, no branded banners, no custom cocktail menu featuring the Nolan Tech logo. Instead, a woman in a white wedding dress stood at the altar, dabbing her eyes as the officiant spoke. Guests turned to stare at him, horrified by his dramatic entrance. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered, taking a slow step back. But before he could retreat, a bridesmaid in a pale blush dress stormed up to him with fire in her eyes. "You just crashed my sister's wedding," she hissed, grabbing his arm and practically dragging him toward the exit. "What kind of man thinks he can barge in like he owns the place?" "I do own the place," Victor replied, brushing off her hand. "Or at least I thought I did for the night." The woman gave him a sharp glare. "Well, you thought wrong. This is the Taylor-Prescott wedding, and unless you're planning to give a toast about love and commitment, I suggest you leave before my mother sees you." Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the words stalled the second he actually looked at her. She was stunning. Not in the perfect, polished way of women he usually dated. Her hair was swept up in a messy bun, strands escaping around her face. Her eyes were fierce, the color of molten amber. Her dress hugged her curves, elegant but simple, and her voice sharp, unapologetic, real. "I'm sorry," he said, quieter now. "This mix-up wasn't intentional." She blinked, caught off guard by his sudden shift. "Wait, you're not just a drunk guest from the bar. No, I'm Victor Nolan, CEO of Nolan Tech." Her jaw dropped slightly, then she narrowed her eyes. "The billionaire tech guy, guilty," he said, smiling a little now. "And apparently guilty of crashing weddings, too." She crossed her arms. "Well, Victor Nolan, you've got about 10 seconds before the bride's mother shows up and tries to murder you with a butter knife." Victor laughed. "You're surprisingly calm for someone dealing with a disaster." "I'm not calm," she said, turning to walk him out. "I'm in survival mode. I'm the maid of honor. I've been up since 5, my heels are too tight, and now I'm babysitting a billionaire who can't read a booking calendar." "Can I at least know your name before I'm exiled forever?" he asked as they reached the grand marble hallway. She paused, then glanced up at him. "Vera Taylor." "Vera," he repeated, liking the sound of it. "Well, Vera, if I don't get tackled by security, maybe I'll see you again." "Only if you crash another wedding," she said, disappearing back through the doors. Victor stood there for a moment, watching the closed doors like they might open again. He didn't know why, but something about her stuck with him. The way she didn't care about his money. The way she looked at him like he was just another guy who messed up. And the way her voice still echoed in his mind. 2 nights later, Victor couldn't stop thinking about her. He sat in his penthouse suite overlooking the city, a glass of scotch in one hand, the other resting on his thigh. "Why her?" he muttered. He dated models, actresses, heiresses. All of them beautiful, all of them predictable. But Vera, she'd called him out, challenged him, put him in his place without flinching. And she hadn't batted an eye when he told her he was a billionaire. That kind of honesty was rare, and he wasn't about to let it go. Vera was not thinking about Victor. Okay, maybe she was. A little. But only because her sister's wedding had turned into a viral moment. Someone had caught the moment Victor barged in, and the video had nearly 500,000 views online. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from her best friend. "OMG, that's Victor Nolan. You're in the video with him? You look like you're about to kill him, lol." Vera groaned and tossed her phone on the couch. She had way too much work to do to be thinking about some billionaire who accidentally crashed a wedding. She had invoices to process, a bridal boutique to run, and a pile of veils that still needed steaming. But then the bell above the boutique door jingled. She looked up and nearly dropped the dress she was holding. Victor stood there in a tailored navy coat, holding an enormous bouquet of white roses. "Hi." "What are you doing here?" she asked, eyes wide. "I owe you an apology." "You already gave me one." "No," he said, stepping toward her. "I gave you a casual I got caught apology. This is the real one." He handed her the bouquet. "These are for you, and so is dinner if you say yes." She blinked. "You came all the way here to ask me out." "I didn't crash your sister's wedding on purpose," Victor said, voice softer now, "but I don't believe in accidents anymore. I believe I was meant to walk into that room and meet you." Vera stared at him, heart pounding. "I don't date billionaires," she said, half joking, half panicked. "Good," he said. "I'm hoping you'll date me instead." She laughed despite herself. "One dinner," Victor grinned. "Just one, for now." He picked her up that night in a Bentley. Vera had never been in a car that quiet or that smooth or that expensive. She tried not to stare at the leather interior or the glowing city skyline as they drove. He took her to a rooftop restaurant she didn't even know existed, the kind of place where the waiters wore gloves and the champagne never stopped flowing. "You didn't have to go overboard," she said, sitting across from him at a candlelit table. "I didn't," he said. "This is just normal for me." She raised an eyebrow. "Must be nice," he smiled. "It is, but it's nicer when I get to share it with someone who doesn't expect it." They talked for hours, about her dream of opening her own wedding dress line, about his company and how exhausting it was pretending like he had all the answers, about their childhoods, their fears, their favorite midnight snacks. Victor had never felt like this. Not this fast, not this real, and when he dropped her off, he didn't ask to come inside. He just kissed her hand, looked into her eyes, and said, "I'd really like to see you again." Vera stood there as the Bentley pulled away, heart racing. She didn't believe in fairy tales, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of one. Vera didn't expect him to show up again. One dinner, that was the deal. But 3 days later, he was standing outside her boutique just as she was flipping the sign to closed. This time, no roses, just a small white box in his hand and a raised brow that made her pulse stir uncomfortably. "I brought cannoli," Victor said as she opened the door halfway. "You mentioned your grandmother used to make them on Sundays." She hesitated. "Don't you have a company to run? 78,000 employees. They've got it covered for one evening." Vera stepped aside without answering. The boutique smelled faintly of pressed satin and lavender detergent. She'd spent the last hour reorganizing a shipment of lace gowns, and her fingers were still pricked from the pins. "I can only stay for 20 minutes, she warned. "Then I won't waste a second," he said, setting the box down on the counter and glancing around. "You really run this whole place by yourself, with one part-time seamstress and a lot of caffeine." He leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the sketches pinned to the corkboard by her desk. "These yours?" "Yeah." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I design in-house for custom clients. It's not exactly Chanel, but it pays the bills." He picked up a pencil and twirled it between his fingers. "They're good, clean silhouettes. Confident lines. You know about dress design now. I know about vision. You've got it." She folded her arms and leaned against the wall. "Why are you really here, Victor?" He turned to face her fully. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. And not just because you're beautiful or sharp, or because you somehow made me laugh while insulting me. It's because being around you feels like the first time I've been honest with someone in I don't even know how long." Vera looked at him carefully. "That sounds nice. But I've heard things like that before, from men who thought I was a good distraction." "I don't want a distraction, I want something real." She crossed the room slowly, stopping on the other side of the counter. "You're used to getting what you want." "That's not how I work, I know." His tone was quiet, serious now. "That's exactly why I'm here." Vera opened the box out of curiosity. Inside were 2 perfect cannoli, dusted with powdered sugar, the filling peeking out with a hint of orange zest. "I haven't tasted these in years," she whispered, surprised by a wave of emotion. "You said the filling was never too sweet, that there was always citrus in it. I tracked down a bakery that still makes them the old way." She looked up at him, her defenses cracking the smallest bit. "You really listened?" He nodded. She took one, biting into the flaky shell. For a second, she was 10 years old again, sitting on a stool in her grandmother's kitchen. Victor didn't speak. He didn't push. He just waited while she finished the last bite. I guess you can stay a little longer than 20 minutes, she said finally. He smiled, but it wasn't smug. It was quiet. Grateful, they ended up sitting on the boutique floor, backs against the display mirrors, surrounded by tulle and ribbon. Vera told him how she'd dropped out of fashion school when her father got sick, how she'd taken over the boutique from an aunt who wanted to retire, how she sometimes second-guessed all her choices but couldn't imagine doing anything else. Victor listened, really listened, and when he spoke, it wasn't about business or money. It was about how he hadn't spoken to his brother in 6 years, about how his parents divorced when he was 12 and he'd buried himself in work to avoid becoming either of them. About how success wasn't nearly as satisfying as he thought it'd be. When he finally looked at the time, it was almost midnight. I should go, he said, standing reluctantly. Vera stood too, brushing a piece of tulle off her jeans. Probably a good idea. I meant what I said. I want something real. I'm not going to rush you, but I'm not going to disappear either. She met his gaze. I'm not asking you to disappear. I just need to know this isn't a game. It's the furthest thing from one. He left without trying to kiss her. And that somehow felt more intimate than if he had. The next morning, Vera woke up to find a garment bag hanging from the boutique's front door. Inside was the dress she doodled on the back of a receipt last week, a sleek off-the-shoulder number with a plunging back and pearl-threaded straps. Not the actual dress, but a sample made to her exact sketch, expertly stitched. There was no note, just a single white tag that read, "You're not Chanel, you're better." She didn't know whether to be flattered or furious. She chose both. When he showed up later that afternoon, she met him at the door with the garment bag in hand. "Did you break into my sketch pad?" she asked. "I may have taken a photo when you weren't looking. That's a violation of trust. I was trying to impress you." She narrowed her eyes. "It worked," he grinned. "Then I'll just have to keep doing it." "You're really not used to hearing no, are you?" "I hear it all the time. I've just learned to wait it out." She studied him for a long moment. "You're relentless." "I'm invested," she sighed, but there was a flicker of a smile. "Fine, one more dinner. I'll pick you up at 7. She turned away before he could see her blush, and she didn't realize until much later that she hadn't even asked where they were going. Vera had never been inside a private gallery before. She stood at the threshold of the glass building, tucked discreetly between two brownstones in Midtown, watching as Victor spoke to a man in a charcoal blazer who immediately handed over a set of keys. Once the door clicked open, Victor turned and held it for her, his hand brushing lightly against her back. "You rented an art gallery?" she asked, stepping cautiously inside. "Technically, I own it," Victor replied, "but it's managed independently." "I just borrow it when I'm trying to make a point." She raised an eyebrow. "What point are you making tonight?" He gestured for her to follow him. "That I want you to see the world the way I do through the things I've built, the spaces I've created, and that includes this." The interior was dimly lit, minimalist, warm, not cold and sterile like she'd expected. Sculptures stood on white pedestals, bold oil paintings hung across the walls, and in the center of the room was a long table set for 2 crystal glassware, tapered candles, and a bottle of something dark and expensive breathing beside the plates. "Is this your work?" she asked, stepping closer to a painting in shades of navy and rust. "No," he said, "but I commissioned it. I fund artists who need a start. No strings, just space and time." She glanced at him. "I didn't think you were the patron of the arts type. People assume I only care about numbers." He walked over to a sculpture of brushed steel that curved like a ribbon in midair. "But this is what I never get to talk about. The things that don't have a bottom line." Vera studied the sculpture, its smooth edges casting shadows against the white walls. "It's strange. It's supposed to be. The artist said it was about control and letting go. I didn't understand it until I met you." She turned to him, uncertain. "What does that mean?" "I've spent years curating everything in my life, my image, my business, even my relationships. But you," his voice dropped, "you don't let me curate anything. Not what I say, not what I feel. You pull it out of me without even trying." She looked away, clearing her throat. "You say things like that too easily." "No, Vera, I say them because I mean them." They sat down to dinner. The food arrived in quiet intervals, brought by a chef who vanished as quickly as he appeared. Everything was plated like art, but neither of them paid much attention to it. "So," she said between bites of saffron risotto, "you've told me a lot about what you've built. But what do you regret?" He paused, folding his hands slowly. "Not returning my brother's call before he left for France. He asked to meet. I ignored it, thinking there'd be time. That was 4 years ago. I haven't heard from him since." "I'm sorry," she said gently. Victor nodded once. "I tell myself I was too busy, but really I was too proud." They were silent for a moment, the sounds of the city muffled by the glass walls around them. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you regret?" Vera hesitated, then reached for her wine. "Not applying to the design incubator at Langford last year. I had the application finished. But I convinced myself I wasn't ready. Why didn't you tell me this before? I didn't want you to think I was still figuring things out." He leaned forward, his voice firm. "Anyone worth anything is still figuring things out." She looked at him, something between admiration and fear flickering in her eyes. "You make it sound easy. It's never been easy. But it's easier when you stop pretending you have to be perfect." Another silence stretched between them, this one heavier, more charged. Then he said, "Come to Singapore with me next weekend." She blinked. "What?" "I have a keynote at a global finance summit, 3 days. I'll have time between events. The hotel's already booked. You'd have your own suite, full access to the design district. There's no pressure. I just want to share the world with you. I can't just leave the boutique. I already called your seamstress, asked if she could cover. She said she could if you agreed to finally take a break." Vera narrowed her eyes. "You called my employee." "She didn't tell me anything personal, just said you haven't had a proper vacation in 2 years. I don't know if I'm impressed or terrified. Hopefully both. But mostly I just want you to say yes." She looked down at her plate, then back up at him. "I don't travel with men I've known for less than a month." He nodded. "Then let's fix that." A beat passed before she said, "I'll think about it." Victor didn't push. He simply reached across the table, took her hand carefully, and said, "I'll wait." Next morning, Vera stood outside the boutique before opening, clutching a thick envelope that had been hand-delivered. Inside were 2 plain tickets, one for her, one blank, no note, no signature. Just a single boarding pass and the chance to choose. She stared at it for a long time, heart hammering like a warning or a promise, and she had no idea which. Vera didn't decide to go to Singapore until the morning of the flight. She left the boutique keys with Marisol, her seamstress, scribbled a checklist of everything that needed to be handled, and packed a carry-on with more uncertainty than luggage. She didn't tell Victor she was coming. Something inside her wanted to see if he truly meant what he'd said. When she arrived at the airport, she found her name waiting at the private terminal desk, along with a sleek black folder containing her boarding documents and a note written in clean, angular handwriting. No expectations, just time. The jet was already on the tarmac, its engines low and steady, like it had been waiting just for her. She boarded in silence. Victor was seated by the window, dressed down in a white linen shirt and slate trousers, a paperback novel resting on the table beside him. He looked up, and if he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. Instead, he stood and took her bag with a quiet, "You came." "I did," she said, settling into the seat across from him. "You're lucky the cannoli were good." He gave a low laugh. "I'll never underestimate citrus filling again." They didn't talk much during the flight. There was something oddly comforting about the silence. She watched the sky change through the window while Victor read beside her, occasionally glancing up as though to check she was still really there. When they landed, a sleek black car was waiting. The hotel wasn't just luxurious, it was unreal. A suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Marina Bay, a terrace with an infinity pool, and a walk-in closet already stocked with soft robes and silk slippers. "I didn't arrange anything in your room beyond comfort," Victor said as she stepped inside. "No assumptions." She turned to him. "You're being careful. I'm trying to be respectful." "Good," she said, her voice softer than before. "Because I'm still figuring this out." "I'll wait," he said again, and this time she believed him. That evening, she wandered through the design district alone while Victor attended his keynote. She ducked into a small studio tucked between 2 towering buildings, drawn by a display of hand-beaded gowns on faceless mannequins. The designer, a woman about her age, noticed her sketchpad and struck up a conversation. They talked for over an hour about embroidery techniques, sustainable fabrics, and the brutal honesty of clients who changed their minds mid-stitch. The designer handed Vera a card and said, "If you're ever in the city again, I'd love to collaborate." That offer stayed with her as she walked back to the hotel, the card tucked into her sketchbook like a promise. Victor was already waiting in the rooftop lounge when she returned. He stood from the corner booth as soon as he saw her, pulling out a chair without a word. He didn't ask what she'd done that day, and she didn't ask about his speech. Instead, she surprised herself by saying, "There's a woman here who runs an atelier. She invited me to collaborate." He poured her a glass of wine. "Are you considering it?" "I don't know," she admitted. It felt good to be seen by someone who didn't know you existed. Victor didn't flinch. "I want you to be seen by the whole world, Vera, for your vision." "Not mine." She looked at him, really looked, and something in her chest shifted. "You know," she said, "this trip should have made me more confused, but it didn't." He waited. "I think I'm scared because you're not forcing anything. You're just here. I'm not going anywhere." The next day, he handed her an invitation to an exclusive industry dinner hosted by a couture house. "I was going to go alone, but I'd rather go with someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing." She stared at the embossed card. "Does this mean I have to wear something dramatic?" "There's a dress waiting in your room. I had it tailored to your sketches." She narrowed her eyes. "How many of my sketches did you steal?" "Just enough to know you're brilliant." That night, she walked into the gala beside him, not as his date, not as his accessory, but as his equal. The heads that turned didn't faze her. She introduced herself as a designer. She handed out her card. And when a senior buyer from a luxury department store asked where she was based, she said, "New York, but I travel." Victor didn't hover. He didn't interject. He simply watched her take up space in a world she hadn't dared step into before. Later, on the balcony overlooking the city, Vera turned to him and asked, "Why me?" He didn't hesitate. "Because you see me, and you make me want to see more of myself." She exhaled, her hands resting on the railing. "I didn't come here for an answer. But I think I found one anyway." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then let's stop looking. Let's build something instead." When they returned to New York 2 days later, Vera unlocked the boutique and found a letter on her desk. It was from the Langford Design Incubator. "We're reopening this season's applications due to an unexpected dropout. Your previous file was exceptional. We'd love to offer you a spot." She stared at the words for a long time, then looked up as the door chimed open. Victor stood there, holding coffee in one hand and a small velvet box in the other. "Before you say anything," he began, "this isn't what you think." She tilted her head. "Then what is it?" He opened the box. Inside wasn't a ring, it was a custom engraved thimble. "For the woman who stitches her own future," he said, "and lets no one else write the pattern." She laughed, one hand over her mouth, and he finally stepped forward, cupping her face. "I love you," he said, the words simple, steady, "not for who you might become, but for who you already are." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "Then you should know something." "What's that?" "I love you too. Even if you're a little reckless with event calendars." He kissed her then, finally, completely, as the city moved around them and the boutique lights glowed behind the glass. And just like that, Vera Taylor, the maid of honor who never believed in fairy tales, found herself in one she'd written by hand with the man who'd crashed a wedding and, without knowing it, stumbled into forever. The sun filtered through the boutique's windows, casting soft golden light over the work table where Vera traced the outline of a new bodice. Her hands moved confidently, her pencil sweeping across the muslin with a kind of ease she hadn't known before. Everything around her had changed, but it was the quiet certainty in her own movements that felt most surreal. Victor leaned against the doorway, a coffee in each hand, watching her with a quiet reverence he didn't bother hiding. "You've been at it since dawn," he said, offering her the cup she liked, dark roast, oat milk, 1 sugar. Vera took it without looking up. "I had an idea at 4, couldn't sleep until I got it down." "You're still glowing," he said, stepping closer. Even with no sleep, she finally looked up, lips curved. Maybe it's the adrenaline of finally doing what I've wanted to for years. He took a seat across from her, folding his sleeves. "They confirmed your slot at Langford," she nodded. "I start the residency next month. I'll be there 3 days a week. Marisol will cover the boutique those days. And you're still going ahead with the studio space I found. I signed the lease yesterday. It's small, but it has north-facing windows and the kind of silence that makes you want to create." Victor studied her for a moment, noting how different her energy was now, centered, steady. "You're not waiting anymore." "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Then I guess you're ready for this." She opened it and scanned the page, her breath catching. "You bought the building, not just the boutique, the entire block, the bakery, the florist, the framing gallery. I'm creating a local arts trust, rent control, renovation grants, community grants for new artisans." She blinked, stunned. "You did that, for me, for you, for people like you, for the kind of beauty that doesn't get VC funding or press releases." He leaned forward, voice low but certain. "Because you made me see that legacy isn't about skyscrapers and IPOs. It's about who you lift up while you're still here." Vera folded the paper and set it down. "You're not the man I met at the hotel ballroom." "No," he said. "You made sure of that." They were quiet for a moment. A kind of silence that wasn't empty but full. Then she said, "I have something for you too." She rose and stepped into the back room, returning with a garment bag. She unzipped it slowly, revealing a midnight blue blazer tailored with a subtle interior embroidery, his initials, stitched in silver thread beside hers. Victor touched the inside lining with reverence. "You made this. It's for the night you open the Nolan Arts Trust. I figured you should wear something designed by someone who never cared about your net worth." He stood and took her hand. "You've changed everything." "We changed each other," she whispered. Later that evening, they walked into the gallery, the same one he'd shown her months ago, but this time, it wasn't empty. The walls were filled with photographs, sketches, and textiles from local artists. The ribbon sculpture was still there, but now it had a plaque beside it. "Control and letting go." Vera's gowns were displayed on mannequins throughout the room, each one paired with design notes and fabric samples, curated like a story instead of a product line. People moved through the space slowly, studying, admiring, reaching for cards and pausing to ask questions. A well-known art director approached Vera to talk collaboration. A boutique buyer from Paris asked if she'd consider shipping internationally. Victor watched from a distance, never interrupting, simply observing the woman who was no longer simply surviving but thriving. When she returned to him near the sculpture, he asked, "Do you feel it?" "What?" "The life you built. The one you almost talked yourself out of." She didn't answer. She just kissed him right there in front of everyone, no hesitation, no fear, just certainty. 1 year later, the boutique had doubled in size. Her line was carried in 5 cities. She split her time between her new Midtown studio and the original shop, which she'd kept for sentimental reasons. Victor had stepped back from day-to-day operations at Nolan Tech, handing the reins to a trusted partner so he could focus on the foundation. He worked closely with artists, craftsmen, and small business owners, investing in people instead of platforms. They moved into a townhouse in the West Village, filled with things that mattered: her grandmother's sewing machine, his mother's old vinyl records, sketches taped to the fridge, and a dog they rescued from a shelter on a rainy Tuesday. One afternoon, long after they'd wrapped a photo shoot for Vera's spring line, she walked into the living room to find Victor sitting on the rug, papers spread out around him. "What are you doing?" she asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. He held up a sheet. "Trying to figure out how to create a micro-grant for women starting fashion lines outside New York." She grinned. "You're getting soft." "I like to think I'm getting better." She sat beside him and leaned into his shoulder. "You are." He pulled a small box from behind one of the pillows. "Now what's this?" she asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Something I've wanted to give you for a while." She opened it slowly. Inside was a circular pendant etched with the same silver thread pattern she'd stitched into his blazer. In the center, their initials formed a delicate knot. "It's not a ring," he said. "Not yet, but it's a promise." She closed the box gently and kissed his cheek. "That's all I need," and it was, because for the first time in her life, Vera Taylor wasn't waiting for a fairy tale. She was living one written not in fantasy, but in choices, effort, and love that showed up every day. Love that didn't need chandeliers or champagne to prove itself, just two hands held tightly, two lives intertwined by fire and growth, and a future that was entirely, irrevocably theirs.